A little bit about the German army and the German experience of the battle in Normandy, because as we all know, war is a two-man game, or as good old Clausewitz once said, well, it's a duel on the grand scale. And I hope you've noticed how cleverly I managed to squeeze the dead Prussian already into the very first sentence. I mean, if that isn't great, I don't know what is. It's the first and only time I mention him, I promise you. It is impossible to really understand a battle or a campaign if you concentrate fully on one side, so that's why we also need to look at the enemy in this particular battle, i.e. the Germans. When you look at the way the Battle of Normandy is being remembered, commemorated in Germany, there is nothing of the scale that you can see in Britain today. So very briefly, I watched it on the telly this morning. You don't have anything like this, what goes on in Portsmouth like this in Germany at the moment. Angela Merkel actually is in England, so she's not commemorating or whatever back in Germany. So why is that? You might say the obvious reason for that is that Germany lost that battle. I mean, that's pretty obvious and clear, isn't it? Not only this battle, but many subsequent battles, and of course eventually the war, which doesn't really help when it comes to all these commemorations. One could also argue that the Battle of Normandy and the outcome of the war in the West had already been decided before the battle actually started. The sheer military superiority of the Allies was certainly the key factor here. By 1944, just to give you a few examples, the Battle of the Atlantic had been lost for the Germans, and Allied strategic bombing had already turned many German cities into rubble. Also, and you might say this is the key point when it comes to the remembrance, it should not be forgotten that by 1944, well, the 6th of June, and then the 10 weeks of fighting in Normandy, that Germany had been fighting an extremely bloody war on the Eastern Front for over 3 years. In total, just to give you an idea, about 80% of all German casualties during the Second World War were sustained on the Eastern Front, not fighting against the Western Allies. The German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, had lost a staggering 1.85 million men between June 1941 and May 1944, and these are only the killed and the captured, so excluding the wounded. On 22nd of June 1944, so while the Battle for Normandy is still ongoing, just about 2 weeks over D-Day, and exactly, and that's why it's important, 3 years after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration. Mungo already mentioned it briefly, which led to the rapid collapse of the entire German Army Group Center in Russia. One could argue that this was the gravest military defeat the German army ever suffered in its entire history. And as Mungo has already said, the entire Normandy campaign has to be seen within this context. To say very clearly, the Germans had already lost the war when the Allies landed in Normandy. D-Day did not change or alter the outcome of the Second World War, although it accelerated the decline of the Third Reich. The inability to push the Allies back into the sea meant that Hitler's great strategic plan for 1944 had failed. After pushing the Allies back into the sea, he intended to move the bulk of the troops from the Western Front to the east to then successfully fight the Soviets. His great plan, as we know, with the benefit of hindsight, was nothing but a castle in the sky. This was also recognized by the leading officers of the Wehrmacht in the West. On 17th of June, in a meeting with Hitler, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who was the supreme commander of the German forces in the West, and Field Marshal Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, you all know him, commander of Army Group B, demanded that the war be brought to an end immediately. Even more drastically, on the 1st of July, Rundstedt told Field Marshal Keitel, he was the head of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, the OKW, when asked what they should do. And he said, "Make peace, you idiots." There's some debate over what exactly he said, but I think you get the idea. Of course, what did not happen was, as we all know, that they made peace, but the next day Rundstedt was relieved of his command. There we go. On paper, on D-Day, the Wehrmacht was still a formidable fighting force. In the West, the Germans had about 1.5 million men, 900,000 in the army, about 350,000 in the air force, about 100,000 in the navy, and about 100,000 in the Waffen-SS. The army could muster in total 58 divisions. The problem was these were of very varying quality. The bulk of these units were standard infantry divisions, and this meant that these guys marched into battle just like their fathers had done in 1914. More than half of these divisions were classed as, to use the German term, bodenständig, which indicated an even lower mobility compared to the normal infantry divisions. And so you can see that the general mobility of the German divisions in the Western Front was even lower than that of the British ones that John's already talked about. Most of these divisions have been formed in the West from 1941 onwards, either as occupation forces or as replacements for units and formations that had been destroyed on the Eastern Front. Their equipment was a pure hodgepodge of weapons and material captured in earlier campaigns. Only approximately 40% of the troops, roughly 60% of the officer corps, had combat experience, again mainly gained on the Eastern Front. To overcome the perceived or real manpower shortage, the German army actually became quite inventive. About 10% of the troops fighting in German uniform were not Germans. The most peculiar of these were the so-called Osttruppen, the eastern troops, which include Russian, Georgian and Azerbaijani soldiers fighting in Normandy. Now if you think about it, well, most of these had volunteered to fight in the German army because the prisoner of war camps were kind of death traps where they'd be starved to death. So you join the German army, you put in a uniform, and you as a Russian in France for the Germans fight against the Americans or the British. Just think about their combat effectiveness. Probably not the most impressive one. The army also formed units of formerly medically unfit soldiers, which they called the famous stomach and ear battalions. Another problem was that this dubious quality of the troops did not stop at the higher ranks. Most generals had been posted to the west because of poor performance on the Eastern Front, health problems, or because they had spoken out against the conduct of war that the Wehrmacht waged in the East, the War of Annihilation. Famous exception to this general rule was, of course, again Field Marshal Rommel, commander of Army Group B, again the famous Desert Fox, you've all heard of him. He was the youngest Field Marshal of the Wehrmacht at that particular time. However, Rommel's energy was not enough to overcome homemade structural problems that the Wehrmacht was facing in the West. There's quite a detailed piece on that in the bar. I'm going to keep it a bit shorter, so if you're interested in that, you've got the more detailed version there. On 12th of May 1944, so less a month before the Allies started the invasion, a new organizational structure of the forces in the West was adopted. Rundstedt, as supreme commander of the German forces in the West, was now in command of Rommel's Army Group B up in the north, roughly speaking, the newly formed Army Group G in the south of France, and also Panzergruppe West, Panzer Group West. I shall be using the German term. It just sounds better, doesn't it? Let's face it. That's the way it is. Panzergruppe sounds so much more impressive than Panzergroup. So Panzergruppe West, which had been set up at the turn of 1943 to 44 as a command authority for the mechanized divisions. On paper, this created a pretty tight command structure. In reality, however, in-house fighting over the competencies continued, which resulted, you might say, in a half-baked compromise. 4 tank divisions of the Panzergruppe West, named the OKW Reserve, came under the direct command of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, OKW. You all know the story if you've seen Normandy films when they say, well, the Hitler is asleep, we can't release the tank reserve. And only because, well, then he's awoken at midday and that's too late to relieve the tank reserve. It's these divisions they're talking about. The remaining 6 divisions were split between Army Groups B and G. There was still no joint command structure, and the Air Force and the Navy did not take any orders from the Army. They were under mere instructions to cooperate with the Army High Command. The Waffen-SS also stood partially outside of Rundstedt's control. The end result of this in-house fighting and Hitler's typical style of leadership of Divide et Impera was a muddled command structure with overlapping responsibilities and duplication of effort. General Blumentritt, Chief of Staff of the Supreme Commander in the West, summed this up already in January 1944 by saying, "Here everything is so complicated, entangled in a web of 100 possible departments that it takes a long time for a newcomer to understand what is going on behind the scenes." Just to give you an idea what this duplication of effort actually meant, in one period of 24 hours, Rundstedt's headquarters received 8,788 telephone calls. In April 1944, we had over 50,000 members of the Wehrmacht employed in a myriad of positions in Paris alone. So not the tightest command structure you can think of. Organizational matters were made more complicated by an ongoing debate among the senior commanders about the deployment of the tank reserve, you might say, the iron fist of the army in the West. Everybody agreed that the so-called Atlantic Wall would not stop an invasion. It was basically supposed to be the tripwire which would slow down the enemy. And the idea for the defensive battle was characterized by a two-step approach. So you slow down the enemy on the Atlantic Wall, which then gives you time to bring up the strong reserves from the hinterland. But the question was where to place these reserves. The two protagonists in this debate were Rommel and a general called Leo Geyer von Schweppenburg, good German name, commander of the Panzergruppe West. Rommel wanted to break up the reserves and deploy the tank divisions as closely to the beach as possible. He argued that Allied air superiority, as he'd experienced, for example, in North Africa, would make it impossible for the Germans to move the reserves up to the front line once the landings had occurred. Geyer, on the other hand, had gained his operational experience mainly on the Eastern Front, even though he had served as defense attaché, the first defense attaché after the First World War in London. Wrote a book about it, it's a fascinating read. As a consequence of his experience, he argued that the tank reserve should be held back and only be deployed once the Allied force had landed and the Schwerpunkt, the main point of operation, was clear. He argued that the superior operational skill of the Wehrmacht would be able to defeat the Allies, and they would be able even to defeat a numerically superior enemy, as had happened so often at the tactical operation level on the Eastern Front. And this debate is not just a debate between two generals behind closed doors, but it's of utmost importance for the conduct of the battle on the German side. Because not only is it part of the confused command structure, but it goes straight to the heart of the army's ability to defeat the invader. Because the tank reserve was the perceived trump card of the German army in the West. In contrast to the rather sorry state of the rest of the army, it was pretty well equipped. It had tank divisions, 4 of these from the Waffen-SS, 2 further tank divisions to be brought by the end of June, and some other heavy detachments. In total, they had about 1,600 tanks and tank destroyers. So this force was supposed to turn the tide and ensure that Germany could win the battle in the West, or the campaign. Fortunately, as we know, for the Germans, reality would prove different. The model command structure, Allied air superiority, and resupply issues, on which I'm not touching here because that's such a broad topic and needs a lecture of its own, meant that the divisions were brought to the front line piecemeal. And rather than having this very powerful knockout stroke against the enemy, what you ended up with were a number of mere slaps in the enemy's face. And these strategic and operational problems made the tactical fight more than difficult. Nevertheless, the Germans still believed that on the whole they were the superior soldiers. In tradition with German military thought, they believed that will, determination, and also the willingness to sacrifice one's own life would prevail over the material of the Anglo-Americans. An after-action report from the Waffen-SS Hitler Youth Division shows that very clearly. And I quote, starts by saying, "Tommy is no soldier. He is afraid of the cold steel of the bayonet, and he cannot stand the sound of our machine guns when they open fire." End of quote. What at first glance sounds pretty heroic, doesn't it? And very, you might say, Wagnerian, if you want to call it that. Is actually, in fact, if you start thinking about it, an indirect proof that the Germans could not match the Allied superiority in materiel. The Allies could afford to use their superior firepower, as John has already mentioned earlier. The Germans could not. They put bodies of men against shells, and the result of this approach was clear. Will and determination might break an enemy force, but they cannot break enemy artillery shells. To sum up, the German army in Normandy was acting with an unfavorable strategic position from the beginning. Its alleged operational brilliance was denied partly due to internal quarrels and also to enemy superiority, in particular in the air, and an effective Allied deception plan which made the Germans believe that the main attack would appear in the Pas-de-Calais area. Tactical actions, as impressive as they might have been at times, caused a high blood loss and could not turn the tide. The question really, when you look at the German army in Normandy, should not be why the Germans didn't win in Normandy, but the question should be how they could fight for as long as they did. Because the German soldiers who fought and died in Normandy fought a losing battle right from the beginning.